Well, hashing in chocola rish in Richard agus Olive Tom Devine. Ha Girach in Dior Shaw Skrivig agus Ailshig. So we're joined here today by Sir from 2015, knighted, Sir Professor Tom Devine. And for those outside of Scotland, he's often spoken of as Scotland's pre-eminent historian. So congratulations.
Thank you very much.
On the book. There's been quite a lot of books written about the clearances. What makes your book more important for people to buy and read?
Well, a number of things I think, but it depends on the reaction of the reader. First thing is it covers the totality of Scotland, rather than one part of it, the Highland region. And secondly, it stretches the time frame from about 1600 to 1900. Normally books on they're all on the Highland clearances, there's hardly been any work done on the Lowland clearances. They stretch from probably the mid-18th century down to maybe the middle 19th century. Whereas I think it's important to understand the long-term process of this, and also the very fact that we need to understand the nature of the old society before we actually undertake an analysis of how it was effectively demolished and destroyed.
Speaking of those societies that were effectively demolished and destroyed, the place where my great-grandfather's grandfather and his entire village were cleared from was actually Shiaba in South West Mull. When did you hear about Shiaba for the first time?
Well, it's a very intriguing story actually, because I was writing a book. I think the researching was going on and maybe starting to write some first drafts. And I had a research assistant called Willie Orr, who had been a mature student at the University of Stirling and then came to work with me on an advanced graduate degree. It turned out that Willie had been a former hill shepherd in Mull. He was a mature student, so he went to university. And he told me about this place, and he said, you must go and see it. I knew nothing about it, and so with some of the younger members of the family at that stage, I think 3 of them, this would be 1987, I came to Schoolhouse, which is the last dwelling point, if you like, before the track to Shiaba. And the person who greeted me, who actually owned the flats, the self-catering flats at that time, now dead, was very intriguing, because when I asked him, we wanted to see a place called Shiaba. This would be in the late evening. This is the gloaming, that is, the sun was setting in September, early October, I think it was. Yeah, it was late September. Just about now, in fact, as we speak in 2018. And he'd been very affable and talked to us a lot. His name was James McKean, Jimmy McKean. And he then stopped and started to behave in a most unusual way, because he was moving his head like that, And the reason why he was behaving like this is because in Scots law, he had what was called an interim interdict, which prevented him from advising people how to get to the township.
Why was that?
It was the estate in question, the estate of Scour, that's SCOR, was owned by a very unpleasant individual who, when he started to go through the process of selling it, was discovered that he'd made his fortune as a South African gun runner. He and Jimmy had a business arrangement and had fallen out. And in fact, as you moved up to the track towards Schoolhouse, which was actually a former destitution road, that is, when the famine took place in the 1840s, the people, to avoid starvation, were given meal, but they had to earn it by the sweat of their brow, because that was the Victorian attitude. Otherwise it would result in what they call demoralisation of the poor. And at the entrance to the destitution road, going up to Schoolhouse, there was a placard which at that stage we don't understand. James McKechnie, currently resident in Schoolhouse, has no legal rights on any part of this place and is not permitted to give direction to anybody to any part of this estate, and then signed the landowner. Of course, time has moved on. That character is long gone. Ironically enough, Jimmy nearly came into the ownership of the estate because his son had done very well in Hong Kong as an investment banker and wanted to buy his father, the son, to buy the estate itself. It was £450,000 upset price at that time. But he was outbid by a Dane whose family now still owns the place, which is quite ironic because the current landowner from Denmark once said to me, you know, Tom, you wouldn't be able to buy any land in my country, but I can buy this land in your country. And I said to him, I'm sorry, X, but your days of ownership are numbered.
So are you saying that there was specific provision in Scots law effectively preventing Scottish people from even finding out about these clearance of sites?
This was an unusual example. It was because of a business dispute between two people who were former business partners. In other words, it was specific to the Scour estate, which I remember old Jimmy telling me, Tom, it's not an estate at all, it's the arse end of an old sheep farm. No, that was a specific issue. But issues like that were not unusual because of the omnipotent power, until recent land reform, of the Scottish landed class, which is still one of the most concentrated in Europe.
So I found out there's roughly 7,104 towns and villages in Scotland, whether or not that includes clearances villages where there are no longer any inhabitants, I'm not sure. But out of over 7,000 places in Scotland and all the places you've researched as part of your work, what made Shiaba so important to you that you not only described it as the most significant site in the Western Highlands and a perfect laboratory for examining clearances, village layouts, but I understand that you invested so much of your life, even your future, in buying a house near there.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, immediately after 1987, we started to go as a family every year to rent one of the houses in the complex in the area, and then finally, when Jimmy died, his daughter decided that parts of Schoolhouse would be sold up, and we decided to buy. So we have been literally going there every year since 1987, and we're now owners. And I've just recently transferred the ownership to the next generation, my daughters and my son, because they, and perhaps more importantly, the grandchildren, they absolutely love this place. And if you look at the estate, there's no, in terms of scenic beauty, it's obviously the reason why they do so. There are 3 Caribbean-style beaches, an eyrie to which the 2 golden eagles return every year to breed, a herd of feral goats, that's wild goats, descended from the flocks of the clearances when they were released when the people were forced out. If you like, I always tell the kids, look for the marks on the land, and the marks on the land in that area are rich. For example, the Fianachin, that's the Gaelic for cultivation beds. These are sandwiches of soil. You'll see them when the bracken comes down. If you went up to that area now, or any other part of the Hebrides or Western Highlands, in particular areas, if you know where to look, they're everywhere, which demonstrates the scale of the population increase that existed. The broad beds are for grain, and the narrower ones are for potatoes, which of course this was the terrible effect of the Phytophthora infestans, the potato blight in the period 1846 to 1855, at the same time as the Great Irish Famine. But as far as the Highland famine was concerned, that actually lasted for nearly 10 years, with the potatoes rotted, especially in the Western Highlands and Islands, because that area climatically was excellently suited for the transfer of the spores of the blight. Wet, damp, not too cold in winter, and is climatically suitable for the horror. And therefore, even the road itself, you know, because they gave this food in return, these meals, very minimal amounts of grain in return for work. That still exists to this day and is the route up to the house where we have our dwelling. And we rent out parts of the property. And the result is that, you know, you sometimes get complaints from people. No, they love the area, they love the house, etc., but they're very concerned about the nature of the road because it's basically a track. So in order to spike their guns, as it were, I drew up a statement which was then put into an acetate by one of the kids, which explains the history of the road, and then goes on to, you know, tell them that this was built by famished people close to the brink of starvation in the mid 1840s, late 1840s. And then say, we have preserved part of the road or the track so you have the true historical experience. There has not been one complaint since then. So if you then go on to Shiaba, which is about 2 miles, 2 hours walk, there's a number of reasons why I absolutely, you know, it's that hot, that's awful. I mean awful in the sense of awe, struck nature of the combination of delicious scenic beauty and at the same time melancholy. Because the township is the reason I think it's important, and after 3 years going up there I had it scheduled as an ancient monument so it cannot be interfered with. The former gunrunner had actually started to plant Christmas trees, fir trees, you can still see some traces of those where Jimmy and I went down to hack them down by night.
Do you know exactly why he planted the trees inside some of the ruins?
I think it obviously was no commercial purpose. He may have thought they may have looked slightly more elegant or some sort of irrational, because he was clearly an irrational person. I never met him, but I think he was even physically dangerous as an individual and could well have been addled or imbalanced, because it wasn't as if he was building a forestry where he could have made some money. These were only 2 or 3. These were only 2 or 3 fir trees, obviously very small, as I say, the size of Christmas trees there. But they have gone now, and nobody can interfere with it at all. They cannot build on the land. They cannot try to bring the structures back to the way they were, because that would destroy the whole ambience of the place. And it's not simply the buildings, but the entire area is now a scheduled monument, and it's illegal to destroy anything. So the first reason is it's the best example I know of a township with the remains of a schoolhouse, a store, a small chapel further away from the almost like a cell rather than a full-scale chapel, further away, an entry point which is almost like a kind of small port for boats further down on the left-hand side of the beach, 2 click mills, buyers, and of course perhaps the thing that people don't understand when they see the township is that the arable in Highland townships was a very small proportion. The township is known as Bilingual Gaelic, B-A-I-L-E. In Golden Scotland were not known as tunes or farm tunes. What the visitor doesn't appreciate, and especially if they go to other areas as well, is that the actual core of the township, the arable, was probably only about 1/10 of the total area used, because most of it was used for cattle rearing. Because the technique in the Highlands was to play to their comparative advantage by selling cattle to the lowland markets in the 16th, 17th and 18th and early 19th centuries in return for grain, in return for silver or bills of exchange which they could then use to purchase grain. That was a very intelligent technique, because Western Highlands and Islands are not suited to any great extent for arable cultivation. And then the final thing about Shiaba is it was probably the best doing township in terms of not having rental arrears, having reputedly very good land, even having coal seams. in the area, and because of its extent, it had about 142 souls living in it at the time of the removals. So by the comparison or contrast with the other townships in Ross and Mull, it was fairly large size. But the most important thing, it had a reputation as a place where people could live semi-comfortably, given the constraints of Highland life at the time. And so the clearance, which was the first one carried out on the estate, just before the famine struck, but then of course it was intensified during the famine, it sent tremors across the Ross of Mull, because there was a recognition that if Shiaba is to be cleared out, then it's highly likely that we will be in for the same horrific experience. Because you've got to remember, in a subsistence-based society like that, access to land is vital, not simply in terms of housing, etc., but it's vital to life. And so the big question therefore is, well, we can go on to talk about the clearance itself if you want. But the key thing is that it's the other reason why it's important to an historian is it's very richly documented, because in Inverary Castle, the home of even to this day, the homes of the Dukes of Argyll, the archives of the Campbell family, that's the surname of the Dukes of Argyll, are extraordinarily rich, and we have in the files there, they're not open to the public, it's sometimes quite difficult to access, but usually if you play it right, they'll allow scholars to explore the material. Probably the best landed estate archive I've ever worked on in terms of the richness and density of the detail. What we have is the correspondence of the factor Mór, that's Gaelic for the big factor, John Campbell of Ardmore, who came from Islay, which demonstrates the fact that, quote, the clearances, unquote, were actually carried out by Scots and not as the mythology has it, by people coming from England, which is absolute and complete nonsense. So his detailed correspondence explains why he decided to rid of people, the petitions that they made against removal, the scale of the process, how ships, 2 ships were arranged to take people out from Shiaba and other parts of the Ross, and the results of the whole process. And so it's this combination of the archaeology, if you like, what's still there on the ground, and the documentary evidence, which makes it, Stonehenge never say unique, but it certainly makes it highly distinctive. And the people went to a variety of different places. We know that en route from Tobermory, which were taken off other immigrants that stopped in the bay below the township, because it just rests on almost the seafront in an absolutely delectable area. I mean, one of the things I mentioned in one of the press reports when people asked me about it was the aching beauty of that area. It's gorgeous, especially probably its best time to see it is at sunset, because the sun is going down. It's a very emotive sight. So anyway, some of them emigrated directly. Others, and this probably happened to most of them in the first instance. It was the technique that the factors or the estate managers used. It was called crowding in, that is, moving to other townships, cutting up crofts and allowing people to move out, so that the area that they were after for the big sheep farms could be cleared of people, because they needed access to the low ground for wintering the sheep stocks. So many of them were cleared to a place called Artun, and by sheer coincidence I have a poem here which I don't know, I didn't plan to bring this to me, I was using it for another purpose. A poem called in Gaelic, it's actually in the book.
Would you like me to read part of it in Gaelic?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll tell you a very interesting story about it, because first of all, the title is Lament for the Factor Mór, That's the big factor in Gaelic. He was John Campbell, as I've said. This poem is about his death and the reaction to his death of the people, and especially the immigrant communities in Canada. And the author of the poem is definitely somebody, we don't know whether he was moved from Shiaba, but he was a cotter in Artun, which is one of the communities, one of the settlements on the other side of the road. I mean, as you come into the village of Bunessan, from this ferry point from Oban, that is, the ferry point is Craigmure, as you come down the road and eventually arrive close to where we are in School House, there's the township of Bunessan, and slightly further on is Factor Moore's old house, Art Phoenix House, which is on the right hand side. It used to be used as a hotel. It's back now to be used as a private dwelling. This was composed as a satire, and one of the great traditions of 19th century Gaelic poetry is satirical condemnation of sheep farmers, of factors, hardly ever of landowners, which is very interesting. Those who had been responsible for the great changes of the 19th century. And they are a very important source for historians of the fact that the people did not accept this passively. They were not simply distressed, they were raging with anger and vengeance. And this poem is a kind of articulation of vengeance, lament for the Factor Moor.
Shall we read the first two verses?
Yeah, okay.
Haskell and Jurks has sin Sundach Gagvel and Bali Nahine Skintrid ach Lene She gun Hummus na Brianach gun Skribig gun Leich Skvel Kuch Tachgen and Ilach Nahine Schanerich Snur a Hedjed gun Vate Nishin Gad vis Eving Snur a Grunige Shin Kole Bishin Go a Hele Ushkebehemak Gaelwach Fian Wager Shedder Schavishin Tillig for Hurum on a Skirsach Vestu.
Okay, and just to emphasise the point, Shiaba in traditional Gaelic means the place of the 6 cows, which was a way of saying that this was a well-endowed township. And this is the English version. Lament for the Factor Moor. There is news in the land that we rejoice to hear, that the Factor is laid out without a stitch on him but a shroud, without the ability to speak and unable to read or write. The champion of the Isla folk, because he brought in people from Isla to be his sub-factors, is laid low and will never ever rise again. When they go to the boat we will laugh with glee, and when we gather together we will drink toasts to one another, with a good Highland whisky, with strong wine and cider, and we will not be worried any longer, since that great beast has been vanquished. I'll just read one other verse because it's important to a story I want to tell. The Factor will have the preeminence in Satan's pit, and Big Angus, that's Angus McDevin, who was also from Isla, who was second only to John Campbell in terms of the estate management. And Big Angus will be right behind him with a flame of fire. Now, we interviewed the last great tradition bearer in the Mull at McKechnie for BBC Radio 4. There was another historian because we'd also explored a township on the mainland in Argyll called Arichonan. And it was a female producer. Now, this is several years ago, but it just shows the courtesy and gentility and sensitivity of the old Gaelic class. He read it in Gaelic and then he translated it in English. And the next line read, and Big Angus will be right behind him with a flame of fire. And he stopped and he said, I can't really say the next words because of the presence of the lady. And I said, well, don't worry about that. I mean, this is going out to a semi-sophisticated audience. And so he said, Big Angus will be right behind him with a flame of fire up his arse because because of all the oppression that you inflicted on women and children and the people of the country that you drove mercilessly overseas. Can you imagine anybody now being concerned about the use of that commonplace name for buttocks? I think the answer is no.
I actually have had the pleasure of meeting Attie's younger brother and sister.
Yes, absolutely.
And chatting with them in Gaelic, and their cousin well.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Effie and Yuffie and Neil, who lives in...
I don't know these people. I certainly know his sister there. And of course, she's blind, I think?
Yes.
Yes, she's blind, yeah. And who are these?
That's her cousin.
Okay.
So this is Effie and Yuffie. And I met Attie's younger brother, Neil, who lives in Lochaling.
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 Yes, he did tell me he used to visit him regularly. I mean, the great thing about Attie McKechnie was, of course, he didn't go to university or anything, but he was a highly intelligent man who had helped to rebuild Iona Abbey, you know, the Columba Abbey, and you know, amazingly, he and Jimmy and I would go to some of these townships, and because his father was a postman and his grandfather was a postman in the area, he could go round these ruins and tell me exactly the people who inhabited them. It was eerie.
I remember when I first met you in 2015, I'd just come back from trekking to the area for the second time, and you said he could have literally taken me up to the place where my great-grandfather's grandfather lived.
Absolutely. And the interesting thing, Ariel, is that in October, I think it's called Scotland from the Sky or some such name. It's a BBC series, and one of the areas they want to visit in the next series is Shiaba. And they're coming by sheer coincidence. My family and myself will be up there in mid-October, and they're coming in a 4x4, a Land Rover, with their equipment to go down to Shiaba to carry out the filming process. And I told them that if Attie had been alive, because I can only give them some more general comments, they would have been able to tell you which families lived in each dwelling, each of the dwellings that have survived in terms of ruin. It's extraordinary, that degree of, it's the transmission of the oral tradition. It's not written down.
So there's no written record of which families lived in which buildings?
One of the things I hope is that either through the investigations of the School of Scottish Studies at Edinburgh many years ago, because they almost certainly will have interviewed him, but they may not have got down to specific township level. It could be on their files. And the other thing is the archives of the Ross Mull Historical Centre, because I know they have tapes of Mr. McKechnie's recollections, and it's very possible his sister might know of whereabouts of other materials that we haven't yet discovered. But it's an extraordinary evidence of the power of the oral tradition, because we're talking about people who had to leave that area as long ago as the 1840s.
Yeah.
And there were still people alive a few years ago who could name them in terms of the specific housing.
When I met Neil, so my great-grandfather's grandfather was McKechnie, so my paternal grandmother's maiden name was McKechnie.
Yes.
And Neil and his sister and obviously Attie were descended from the McKechnies of Shiaba. And we looked into a couple of things, and Neil's answer and summation was, well, they're all related, so we're quite probably related. And what we think might be the case is my great-grandfather's grandfather actually had a second wife, and I suspect that might have been their grandmother.
Okay.
But do you know how exactly the evictions in Shiaba happened? Like, were the homes burnt, or was it gradual?
There was certainly no burning of it. There's huge mythologies about the clearances, and one of the aims of this book is to try and get as far as we can, which is also very difficult, to the actuality. Excuse me. And fire was very rarely used at all, although there is this reference, the burning in Satan's pit that some people might think, but there's no evidence at all of fire being used in that. And when it was employed, which was quite rarely, it was usually because of a protested eviction. That is, the people standing up against the sheriff officers and those who had been brought to carry out the process. Often if people were moving to another area rather than across the Atlantic or to the cities of the south, they would be given the wooden stanchions of the roof because they were extraordinarily valuable. And so then they would take them across. Arton for many of them went to. It's probably about maybe a 5 or 6 hour walk away from Shiaba township, but it was not a contested eviction. They did petition against it, but there was no what the state would have regarded as illegal reaction to it. What does exist, of course, are the so-called summonses of removal. This is the legal document in Scottish legal tradition which expels the people, and normally they were forced out finally in Whitsunday, or the Whitsunday period, because that was spring, and it was a kind of pseudo-benevolence that they were actually being evicted, not in the harshness of winter, but more or less at the beginning of the summer period or at the end of the spring period. And the summons, and there is a summons reprinted for Sutherland in the book at the end, one of the annexes. The summons would not simply be addressed to the particular tenant. It would mean that his family, his bairns, as it said, his wife, his cotters, his servants, any associates or friends living in the dwelling, and it could sometimes amount to, although it was delivered to one person, it could sometimes amount to maybe a dozen individuals that the one document was intended to expel. One of the difficulties for the historian in using that material is often these documentations were used as threats to force them to pay up rental arrears, etc., and weren't actually usually carried out, sometimes not carried out rather. And so one of the things I had to do in the book was to relate the summonses of removal material in the sheriff court records to the enumerator's returns for the census. Supposing somebody was theoretically being asked to go in 1842, then you would look at the census enumerator's finds for 1851 and see whether they'd actually gone or not. And of course, they might not have gone through eviction. They may have gone because they realised that things were getting pretty hairy, quite difficult, and so it might be better to go.
Even if people weren't burnt out of their houses or the houses burnt, were the houses in Shiaba destroyed like so many others, so the inhabitants couldn't return?
What the aim was to make them clearly and comprehensively uninhabitable, and that is why the roof timbers were always taken off. They were either taken off, or, as I say, if people moved a short distance to other places, they could be given to them. But the other reason was if you destroyed the roofs, not only did it make it uninhabitable, because there's great scarcity of timber in these areas, so you couldn't actually find materials to rebuild, because it was the structure was of wood, and then on top of the roof there would be rushes and peat and a variety of other things to make the roof watertight. But even if but there was another reason for this, because if you had a roof in a house in any part of Scotland, you had to pay rates on it. So the landowner, if he had roofed dwellings, couldn't pay rates. He wouldn't be willing to do that. And so the only house, and it's actually again, it's quite symbolic. The only house left, and it stands above the village, looking down on the melancholy of people who had lived there for hundreds of years, and that's come to a decisive end, was in the 1840s a man who had gone regularly for seasonal or temporary work in Glasgow as a cotton spinner. So he'd made some money, and so the house is actually a modern house, well, modern in terms of the 1840s, and it stands above the village. He also was evicted, but the house then became the shepherd's house, the house of the single shepherd who was responsible for the sheep flocks in that area. And that house was inhabited till the 1930s. and it was inhabited, of course, by the family, and that's why there's still a track to Shiaba, because it was used to bring in coal, etc., for the purpose of the family who were living there. And the tradition is that a great storm during that decade, you should probably know about, ensured that it became uninhabitable, and it stands there now empty as well as the other dwellings.
How does the experience and long-term consequences of the clearances in the Ross of Mull and places like the place of some of my own ancestors in Shiaba compare to the experience of places like Sutherland and Rassie, as described by Sir William McLean in his poem Halley?
Well, obviously there are very strong comparisons and parallels, etc. But I think there were some areas in Scotland, in the West Highlands and Islands, which were thoroughly cleared. And usually there were islands. There were islands like Rassie, and islands like Rum and Muck. And ironically enough, Skye got all quite lightly. I mean, if you go to Skye today, it's actually relatively well populated with crofts compared, for example, to the Ross of Mull. The Ross of Mull was decimated. I can stand above the house, the schoolhouse, which of course originally was the house of the, not the shepherd, but the big sheep farmer, you know, who arrived. So it's quite ironic that an historian of this process is actually, you know, going to bed at night in a house that was, it was built for the person who was responsible directly for the clearance and its aftermath of the surrounding area. There were probably something like 360 individuals lived in the parish of Kilbecuan, which is which is the parish for this area. And there's 2 years ago, until they left, there was 2 permanent residents. There are no permanent residents now, none. And in the, you know, so that is what you mean. What is what I mean by root and branch clearance. And standing above the house, I can look across some areas of the rest of the Mull. I can count 8 townships which were either abandoned in the later 19th century after clearance or were cleared out. You know, places like Ardalanish, Knocknafinig, Scour itself. The farmhouse at Scour, which is next to the big house where we are, was created out of the stones of the dwellings. The sheep fank, that's where they do the dipping for the sheep, on the route up to Shiaba, that was also constructed out of the stone which was pulled apart from the townships, because even at Shiaba, the remains that you see on the land today are probably a fraction. Thank goodness you do see some remains, because they've all gone from lowland Scotland and from most of southern and eastern Highlands. So the marks on the land and the shape of the dwellings can still be seen, as long as you're prepared for a long walk, because of course in those days the sea divided, the sea united and the land divided. So most of these places are, you know, difficult to get to by walking, and tended to get to by sea. But they are there as memorials to that time. And anybody who visits these places, and they are scattered to a great extent right across the inner and outer Hebrides and some areas of the northwest and central mainland, central coastlands, always come away with a deep sense. It can be a spiritual sense, but it's usually a sense of tragedy, sadness and loss. Even if the township in question was not cleared but was simply abandoned, it's the attempt to live in those circumstances, those tough circumstances, and then eventually to give up the struggle. I have to go quite soon.
Okay.
Catherine awaits me. And I don't like to be, or sometimes I do like to be punished by her.
How do patterns and records of migration to Canada and the US compare to those of New Zealand and Australia, where some of my ancestors ended up?
Yeah, no, because remember they're all part of the British Empire, so the material, the archival material is usually quite rich. There've been doctoral theses done, partially from Canadian, Australian and New Zealand sources, as well as from Scottish sources, to build up the picture of the immigrant groups, etc. And of course, as I said earlier, there's an enormous amount of material in landed estate archives, especially if there's an assisted, or what is sometimes referred to as compulsory immigration, where there's a lot of detail on the numbers, sometimes the names and the sexes and the youth and the age groups of the various immigrant parties. So you know that there is little or no difficulty for the 19th century at least, and even to some extent for the 18th century, because there's a huge archive. This of course only affects Canada and not Australia and New Zealand, but there's a huge archive in 1774-5 where the British government was so worried about the exodus of a military-based population during the beginning of the American War of Independence. They carried out a detailed survey of why people were leaving. There's a lot of information on that, which has been used by a great American historian called Bernard Balin to build up a virtually comprehensive picture of that immigrant experience in the 2 years 1774 to 1775. But it's just hard work to finally get results. I always say history is the queen of all disciplines because it's the basis of all the other social sciences. But it's also a very demanding mistress in terms of labour.
What proportion are you aware of in terms of immigrants that died on those journeys? I'm aware in the 6 years prior to 1854, when my own Scottish ancestors left, there was something like 49 ships of immigrants lost at sea. Now we know that quite a lot actually died during the journeys from disease as well, to the extent that I think there's a part of the stretch between Canada and Scotland is known as a coffin trail or something like that.
Well, of course, that's very much a reflection of the Irish story rather than the Scottish story. Well, certainly the deaths at sea were nothing like the scale of the Irish, because they were known really and literally known as the coffin ships. But nevertheless, people did die because the journey was so long and there was a disease problem, there's no doubt about it, especially typhus. The best record we have, the most horrific experience, was of a ship called the Hercules, which actually brought people out. In my own book that resulted from that visit eventually to Mull, it was titled The Great Highland Famine, Hunger, Emigration in the Scottish Highlands. There's a detailed reconstruction in one of the chapters of how day after day, week after week, more people dying, and the horrific, of course, burials at sea, the horrific testimony that when the bodies went overboard, you would sometimes see the attack of shark shoals on them.